Hello, this is Brian again. Welcome to part 2 of my literally a dissertation of the conifers grown here in the Chilao area. I didn't intend this to be a multi-part video, but I know I was going on and on about in part 1 about this little small coast redwood tree that I surprisingly found here. That's definitely a coast redwood. But there's a lot of other trees here. I told you, got a lot of these young, narrow, giant sequoias growing here, and of course, their close relatives, the Calocedrus decurrens, the incense cedars. So, as I was talking about, this area is predominantly the drier version of the yellow pine forest. And what I mean by the yellow pine forest, the drier portion, is predominantly Jeffrey pine as opposed to ponderosa. Now, if you go over by Charlton Flats, unfortunately the area got really hard hit during the Bobcat fire. So unfortunately, a lot of the trees there are gone, but that area is predominantly Pacific ponderosa pine. I guess maybe it's a little more mesic over there, but over here, however, not even 3-4 miles away, it's predominantly Jeffrey pine over here, mixed in with Coulter pine, of course, as our predominant drier yellow pine forest. So we got a lot of other interesting trees planted here. And we actually have a true cedar. It looks like we got a blue Atlas cedar planted here. This is Cedrus atlantica glauca. Totally not a native here, but unlike incense cedar, this cedar is in the pine family, the Pinaceae, and it has a lot of the characteristics of Pinaceae. More needle-like foliage, and I believe it has some kinship with the fir group of the pine family. I believe it has kinship with the Abiatoideae, which is the fir group. And I'm basing this on the fact that the cones of these trees, like firs, are upright and disintegrate upon maturity. So once the seed cones are mature enough, the cone scales are all going to fall off, and all it's going to be left is a little spike. And this tree actually has some mature cones that are basically about ready to split open. Kind of hard to see, because usually in fir and cedar trees, sometimes you have to go a little bit higher up, but not so much in cedrus trees. Abies, like firs, their cones are usually in the upper third part of the canopy. I believe predominantly the cedar cones are as well, but that's not always the case. In fact, sometimes you can see cones on the lower branches too. I'm going to try to see if I can get a good view of these cones without getting the sun in your eyes, and mine for that matter. Let's see here. Like that right there, it's kind of round, upright cones. They're kind of hard to see on camera. If you were here in person, it would be a lot easier to see. They're probably about 3 to 4 inches long, and again, just like on firs, the cones are going to disintegrate and the seeds are going to fall out. So yeah, every now and then, sometimes by these visitor centers and stuff, you'll see these trees planted, and this is what the needles look like on cedars. You can see they're not bundled like pines, even though they kind of look like they are, and they grow on these little short spurs. Let's see if I can get close to one without tripping on something. Oh boy, see if I can reach it without breaking it. I don't want to break it. Oh boy. I'm not very tall, so that's what happens. Trying to be careful. You see, you can't really see that well, but well, just take my word for it. The branches have these little scales, and they're all grouped together at the end of a little peg. You can kind of see it, the texture of the foliage is kind of pegged together. But that's not all we have here either. Again, like I said, we have a lot of our Jeffrey pines. Those are the predominant pines here, and coulter pines. So let's see. If you've ever seen a Jeffrey pine, if you're not too familiar with it, these trees have quite large cones, especially in more favorable places where they can grow more vigorously. So Jeffrey pines can have quite large cones, sometimes about 5 or 6 inches long, maybe even a little longer. All these cones are partially disintegrated. They're kind of large. This is not even an entire cone. This is about 3/4 of a cone. So a decent sized cone. Usually the prickles stand down. So usually you won't have to worry about poking your hands. Usually. And then these trees can get quite large. I've seen some Jeffrey pines here in Angeles National Forest in dry Southern California. In fact, San Gabriel's one of the drier mountain ranges that are just wet enough to support a good coniferous forest, but usually San Gabriel's are quite a bit drier than the San Bernardino Mountains or San Jacintos. But even here, I've seen a few Jeffrey pines in moister locations that get up to about 180 feet tall. I think that's becoming rare now because the bobcat fire burned a lot of those areas, unfortunately. There's a young Jeffrey pine right here. One of our 3-needle pines, and again, it's a yellow pine. And then, let's see, a lot of other stuff too. And I keep showing you these smaller incense cedars. If you want to see where they get larger, these get larger, go down to Chilao Canyon. It's going to require walking along an old abandoned roadbed just on the other side of Angeles Crest. But over there you can kind of see some quite large incense cedars. And then we got our coulter pines too. Coulter pines are usually smaller and squatter in shape and profile. A little more squat, a little more rounded, and a little more irregular. All right, there. Unfortunately, that was a burn victim. Unfortunately, so it might have been a prescribed fire. I don't think the bobcat fire didn't really come quite this far, so there might be some prescribed fire over here. But coulter pines, they get the huge cones with the big claws that come out of them. And then there's a lot more stuff over here. There are actually a couple species that you have to go quite further to the north, even here in LA County, to find. For instance, Got Pinus sabiniana, even gray pines planted over here. They're actually not that uncommonly planted here in Southern California, especially here in Angeles National Forest. I see them planted a lot of times at picnic sites, and a lot of times campgrounds, and yeah, here we go. Pinus sabiniana, the gray pine. There's a gray pine cone, kind of similar to the coulter pine, but a little bit smaller, not quite as heavy, but still quite damaging if it falls on you. Here's a gray pine trunk right here. Very similar to the coulter pine, and that its bark is quite furrowed, as you can see here. So it's got very similar bark to the coulter pine, which is very much native here. However, if you think coulter pine's not a formal looking tree in adulthood, gray pines are even less formal in their later years. So you can see this one here has a bend and a lean, and then it grows up. And if you look at the texture of the foliage, it's quite wispy. So that's a gray pine right there. It's Pinus sabiniana. And from other angles, the foliage is a lot more grayish. Like that one right in the middle, kind of has a ghostly appearance. That's a gray pine. And here's another one right here. This is the one I was just showing you before. So that's Pinus sabiniana. You have to go to the far northwestern corner of LA County to find this one, if you're looking for it. And again, your incense cedar. Now, there's another species of pine. I believe not native, definitely not native to this area. Potentially in scattered spots in the San Gabriels. To my knowledge, to what I've read, this tree is really only native to the San Bernardino Mountains, just south of Running Springs along Highway 330, and also in a small area along Main Divide Road in the Santa Ana Mountains, and it's called knobcomb pine, Pinus attenuata. There are several of them planted around here. Let's go see if I can get up to them before I lose, before my memory runs out. Did a lot of video 2 weeks ago when I was in the Santa Ana Mountains. But we also have knobcomb pines here. See if I can get to them real quickly. They're planted quite often around here in the Chilao area, and planted a lot here in Angeles National Forest. And since this area is very prone to fire, and knobcomb pine is a tree that responds to fire by releasing crazy amounts of seeds, you gotta imagine that tree reproduces like crazy. It most certainly does. So I'm coming up here. It's usually quite a smaller species of pine, not usually known to get very large. However, favorable sites, they have been known to get up to about 80 feet in height. I haven't seen them quite that tall. So this one here, that also kind of has a slightly ghostly appearance. However, it's not a super close relative of the gray pine. Here it is, Pinus attenuata. So the knobcomb pine. And some mule deer, Otocoileus hemianus californicus, darting off into the glazing light of the sun. Okay, so here's Pinus attenuata. These little scraggly ones here, those are knobcone pines as well. They tend to be, they often start off quite narrow, quite bushy, and sometimes they can grow up to be narrow and quite upright, sometimes squat and shrubby. And the knobcone pine has the little warty knobs at the end of the cone scales. That's where knobcone pine comes from. And these trees hold on to their cones for a long time, and the cones can stay closed for decades. Sometimes so long that the developing wood, as it grows, sometimes encircles the cone, so there'll be sometimes cones in the wood of the tree. But it also has a ghostly appearance. But like I said, it's not a close relative of the gray pine. In fact, the closest relatives of gray pines, the Jeffrey pine and the coulter pine, are much more closely related, because knobcone pines are in a completely different group of the pine family. They're in the subgroup Australes. Whereas coulter pines, Jeffrey pines, and ponderosa pines are in the ponderosi group, the yellow pine group. So, I was telling you, we start getting larger incense cedars. Go down in Chilao Canyon, a little bit further down, you get quite a bit larger. I want to see if I can find a coulter pine cone, but it seems to be predominantly Jeffrey pine. But it's always neat to come out and check out the diversity of conifers. The ones planted here and the ones native sure make up for quite a lovely assortment. I'm coming up on some coulter pines now. Alright, let's see. The Jeffrey pines and coulter pines are quite drought tolerant trees. So you can find them in these more exposed ridges. However, I would say that even more so about coulter pine. Coulter pine seems to grow in even hotter and drier locations than even Jeffrey pine. And Jeffrey pine's quite heat tolerant as well. But this is not even a full cone. This cone's gonna get up to about a foot long and weigh about 8 pounds. So that falls on your head, could be fatal. So the coulter pines around here tend to be smaller, because you notice the landscape changes as you come up here. Come over here, it's a lot drier. Now we're mostly in chaparral. It's like we got, I think this might be Perry's manzanita, Arctostaphylos periana. But there, coulter pines can be kind of narrow, especially when they're younger. But then, a lot of times when they're older, they become a little more irregular. Kind of like those gray pines I was showing you, but to a bigger degree. And like I said, cones are huge on coulter pines. So, usually you can tell, even if you don't see cones on the ground, a lot of times you'll see the cones in the tree. If you don't see cones, how do you tell if it's a coulter pine or a Jeffrey pine? Well, they do grow together quite often, so a lot of times you'll have to sniff for vanilla in the bark. If you sniff vanilla in the bark, it's most likely your Jeffrey pine. They do say that even ponderosa can have a vanilla smell as well. But usually coulter pines grow in drier areas than ponderosas. Usually, but they do intergrade, so I'm not going to say it's perfect. But ponderosas are usually much taller trees. Much taller trees. Well, this is going to do it for my Conifers of Chilao video set. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful and informative and interesting, and a way to help identify some of the species of trees you see growing by campgrounds and some of the trees you see growing in the wild here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next episode or my next hiking video. Thanks for